The Nahe Valley, Rhineland-Palatinate, Germany. Rolling hills, narrow valleys, a river cutting between slopes that once held vineyards. The town of Sobernheim has stood here for 650 years. Its historical core is still shaped by the same buildings raised by wealthy families during the medieval and early modern periods. Near the edge of town, where the forest meets the water, a narrow side valley called the Nachtigallental opens into a quiet hillside property. This is the Rhineland-Palatinate Open Air Museum. Its purpose is straightforward: collect historical rural buildings from this region, move them here, and rebuild them as faithfully as possible for future generations to see. Not replicas, the original structures. Dismantled from the villages where they stood, transported, rebuilt here as accurately as the evidence allows, and finished on the outside with the same materials and methods that built them the first time. On the museum hillside, a group of buildings is taking shape, organized as a Hunsrück nahe village. One of them is a farmhouse from Bickenbach in the Vorder Hunsrück. The structure is an Einhaus, a building type native to this region, where people, livestock, and stored provisions all live under one elongated roof. This one was built in the late 19th century. It has two weather-exposed faces, the northwest gable and the southwest facade. In the mountain districts of the Hunsrück, these exposed timber-framed walls were traditionally covered in local slate as protection against the driving rain, the Schlagregen, that attacks buildings on these exposed hillsides. The Bickenbach House arrived at the museum with those surfaces bare. The slate roofers, the Leiendecker, are now putting that right. The slate comes from local quarries. The Hunsrück sits above one of the largest slate deposits in Central Europe. The quarries, called Leien or Shefa Gluben, have been supplying this material for hundreds of years. Every older building in this landscape that has slate on it was built with stone from these same hills. The raw blocks arrive rough from the quarry and are stored inside the barn floor before being brought out to the workspace as needed. Before any tile can be cut, it must be marked. The master holds an iron template against the stone and uses a nail to scratch the precise outline of the required shape directly onto the slate surface. Different parts of the wall take different tile shapes. Kreuzplatten, cross-shaped with a downward-pointing tip. Spitzschablonen, sharp-pointed, angular. Bogenschablonen, rounded at the base with a smooth curve. Each shape creates a different ornamental pattern. Each pattern belongs in a specific zone of the facade. The standard flat tiles that fill the main fields are sorted separately. A helper checks every single stone against a Messlatte, a calibrated measuring board, and places it in the correct size group. Sorted material, efficient installation, a finished wall that does not shift over time. The master slate roofer works at the Haubach, a four-legged oak block, heavy enough to absorb the force of repeated hammer strikes without moving. Set into the top of the block, the Haubrücke, a narrow, slightly curved iron cutting stake with a precision edge that the slate will break against. The pre-marked tile is placed with its scratched line directly over the outer edge of the iron stake. The Leiehammer, the slate hammer, moves from the far edge of the line toward the near edge in a series of controlled downward strikes. Each blow removes a small chip of slate along the marked profile. The hammer itself is one continuous piece of iron. One end is a flat striking face for driving nails. The other end is a thin, sharp bevel for cutting slate. One tool, both functions. When not in use, it hangs from a chain loop at the roofer's belt. Cutting a Kreuzplatte requires rotating the stone to trim each arm of the cross in sequence. Cutting a pointed tile requires following two diagonal lines to a clean apex. When the waste strip left at the edge is minimal, just a thin sliver at the margin, it can be removed in a single decisive blow. That last blow is not guesswork. It is the result of years at this block learning where the stone will break cleanly and where it will fracture across the body of the tile. Every shard on the floor beneath this station represents a decision that was correct. When the tiles are cut, sorted, and ready, they have to reach the scaffold. The helper loads the finished plates into a wooden carrying box organized by pattern type. Cross plates together, pointed together, rounded together, so the roofer on the scaffold can reach for what he needs without searching. He carries the box across the museum yard. The roofer above reaches down. Materials transfer to the elevated workspace. On the scaffold, a second Haubbrücke has been driven directly into the wooden wall boarding. Not every tile will arrive at the perfect size. Every wall section has its own specific edge conditions, window frames that do not fall exactly on module, timber posts at irregular spacings, corner junctions that require custom fits. Local trimming is not exceptional. It is built into the workflow from the start. Before any slate can be nailed to the Bickenbach house, there is a substrate, the Bretterverschalung. Solid wooden boards, horizontal, continuous, nailed tightly across the timber framing of the wall. This is what the tile nails bite into. Bare timber framing would leave too many gaps, too many paths for water to track inside the joint. The boarding closes them all. Installation begins at the bottom. The first row of Kreuzplatten is positioned along the lower edge of the boarding. Each tile has 2 nail holes already punched by the hammer point at the cutting station. 2 wide-headed galvanized nails per tile, driven flush. The stone cannot rattle. It cannot shift. The plates are positioned with the pointed tips facing down. When the second row overlaps the first, set slightly higher, the tips of the first row remain exposed. When the third row overlaps the second row's tips show. This is the Schuppenmuster, the fish scale pattern. Row after row of downward-pointing tips offset from the row above. Water running down the wall surface hits a tip and is directed away from the joint below it. The decorative pattern and the waterproofing are the same geometry. At the building corners, wider Eckplatten are nailed on one face overhanging the vertical timber post. On the adjacent face, the tiles set flush against that overhang. The corner is locked tight. Wind cannot enter. Water cannot track along the timber. Along the top edge of each slate panel, the roofers fix the Riegenleisten, ornamental strips of wood with a serrated, notched profile. They are not merely decorative. Any sheet of water running down the slate surface will hit the notched profile of the strip and be thrown outward from the wall rather than tracking down into the joint below. The serrated wood and the dark slate create a strong visual contrast across the facade. The structure becomes legible, separate fields defined by the timber posts and the Riegenleisten boundaries. Standing back from the building at this stage, the transformation is already visible. The exposed timber framing of a few months ago is now a pattern. 5 workers are on this project simultaneously. 2 roofers on the scaffold, a helper on the ground, the master at the cutting station, and a 5th coordinating the material flow, all of them working in sequence toward the same wall. On the scaffold, before any row can be nailed, the overlap height must be precisely established. A Zollstock, a folding wooden rule, measures the required vertical distance from the last row. A long wooden straight edge confirms the horizontal, then the scoring line. The sharp rear point of the slate hammer is dragged across the face of the installed tiles. It leaves a thin, permanent silver line incised into the dark gray surface. This is the guide mark for the next course. No chalk line, no pencil on slate. The mark is cut directly into the material. For vertical boundaries, window frame edges, timber post faces, a carpenter's pencil marks the wooden boarding. This pencil line defines the width of the Randplatte, the perimeter tile that must be trimmed to fit flush against the window casing. The tile comes off the scaffold-mounted Haubbrücke already trimmed to the right width. It goes to the pencil line. If it fits, 2 nails. If it does not, back to the stake. There is no tolerance for a poor fit at a window edge. Water will find it. The variation in decorative pattern across the facade is not improvisation. Each section was planned before installation began. Kreuzplatten for the main fields, Bogenschablonen for selected panels. The shift between pattern types breaks the surface into distinct visual zones, preventing a large, flat wall from reading as a single, undifferentiated mass. The Bogenschablonen, tiles with smooth, curved lower profiles, produce a different effect from the angular crossplates. Where the Kreuzplatten create a sharp geometric rhythm, the rounded tiles flow into a continuous wave. Both are historical patterns found on traditional buildings throughout the Hunsrück. The craftsman knows which belongs where because he has seen hundreds of these facades. The customer specified the arrangement. The execution belongs to the roofer. The full complexity of the work only becomes visible when you step back and look at the entire facade simultaneously. Each section required its own decisions, its own template shapes, its own edge conditions at every post and frame, its own corner joints, its own pattern rhythm. Each of those decisions was made individually by someone on a scaffold plank with a hammer, a rule, and a pouch of nails. The galvanized nails that hold this slate are industrial now. Before the 20th century, they were hand-forged, every one of them. The quality of the nail determined how long the cladding held against the weather. A nail that corroded in the wood would eventually allow a tile to work loose. Loose tiles admit water. Water destroys timber. The galvanized nail arrived and solved this problem. The technique remained exactly the same. The most labor-intensive element of the entire project is the rosette, a circular ornamental form built from individual slate pieces, the kind of decorative statement wealthy Hunsrück farm owners commissioned for the street-facing facade of their Einhaus to signal to everyone passing that this family had money and status and knew how to spend it on a building. The design begins with wedge-shaped segments, long, narrow, angled tiles arranged in a radiating pattern with each piece overlapping the edge of the tile beside it. Every segment must be measured against the actual radius of this specific rosette. Nothing standardized here. The master cuts each piece individually on the Haubach. Broader pieces require multiple trimming passes. A single heavy blow on a wide slate risks fracturing across the body of the stone. The master takes it in stages. Each pass removes a controlled amount. The correct profile emerges slowly. The final segment closes the circle. It overlaps both adjacent pieces simultaneously. The lock that holds the entire radial pattern together. At the center of the finished circle, the Knauf. Multiple small circular discs, each with hand-notched decorative edges, are stacked and nailed in sequence over the converging tips of the wedge tiles. The result projects slightly from the wall surface, a small, raised relief button that catches shadow and light depending on the angle of the sun. To the left and right of the rosette, the letters J and B, the initials of the man who built the Bickenbach House. Cut from slate, set into the wall of the house that now stands in Sobernheim instead of the hillside in Hunsrück, where he built it. The Bickenbach House is finished on its weather-facing sides. Slate covers the northwest gable and the southwest facade completely. Every timber joint is sealed. Every corner is locked. Every window casing is surrounded. The Schuppenmuster runs in clean horizontal rows between the structural timber posts of the Fachwerk framing. The Regenleisten mark the field boundaries. The rosette sits at the center of the decorative panel. The letters J and B record the name behind the building. Ornamental slate work of this kind is always commissioned, always specific. No two facades are identical because no two buildings are identical. The craftsman's skill is not executing a standard template. It is taking a client's intentions and turning them into something that will hold against a Hunsrück winter for the next 100 years. The Bickenbach House now stands as its builder intended it to stand, because once the ability to read a slate grain, build a Hunsrück corner tight, and set a rosette that will not move, once that is gone from living practice, no drawing can bring it back. Subscribe. More of these trades are coming.